Hey, thanks for checking out my video. Chris here from Meditations on the Tarot. Today I wanted to talk about the story of Persifal and the quest for the Holy Grail, and how this relates to different Gnostic philosophies and concepts, how this relates to the tarot, and how this relates to spiritual alchemy and Rosicrucian philosophy. So the story of Persifal and the Holy Grail takes place during the reign of King Arthur and during the time of the Knights of the Round Table. And it's very important from a Gnostic perspective. So there's a boy and he's living in the woods, and his mother has removed him from society. His father was a very famous knight, and he'd gone off to the Holy Land, and when he'd gone off to the Holy Land, he'd taken a Muslim wife. He'd taken a second wife, and his first wife was so appalled and so hurt by this that she moved Persifal out into the woods, and they were going to live out in the woods, and she was going to keep him away from this kind of stuff, right? So Persifal is playing around in the woods one day as a young boy, and he sees these three knights coming through the woods, and he gets down on the ground, and he starts bowing, and the knight said, "What are you doing? Why are you bowing, kid? Get up." And he said, "Well, my mother told me, if you see angels, you have to bow. If you're in the presence of angels, you must bow." And they said, "Get up, kid. We're knights. We're not angels. We're knights." And he said, "Well, what's a knight?" And they said, "Well, we go around, we keep law in the land and protect that which is sacred." And he said, well, I want to be a knight." And they said, "Well, you can't be a knight." And he said, "Well, I want to anyways." And they said, "Well, if you want to be a knight, you have to come to King Arthur's court." So Persifal goes to King Arthur's court, and when he arrives at King Arthur's court, there's a bad knight, and he's offended Queen Guinevere. He's Princess Guinevere, and he's offended her, and he's kind of a bad dude, he's kind of a bad guy, and all the other knights are kind of afraid to do anything about it, and Persifal says, "Oh, I'm not scared. I'll take him on." So he throws a bucket over his head, and he grabs a broomstick, because he doesn't have any armor or anything, and the first thing he does is shove the broomstick through the face gear of the offending knight, and he kills him. And that solved the problem, but that's not how it's done according to the rules of chivalry. You don't aim for the face, and so in this way he sort of brought shame on King Arthur's court, and from this moment he was known as the Fool. And so in the tarot, the first card is the Fool, and then the Fool goes on and he meets all these different archetypal characters, and one of the characters that he meets is called the Hermit, and this is the Hermit card. So Persifal decides that he's going to become a knight, and he's going to go on this quest for the Holy Grail, and he quests, and he doesn't quest for very long, and he comes upon the Grail Castle, the mountain of salvation, Mount Salvation. He comes across the Grail Castle, and he comes into the Grail Castle, and the Grail King has been wounded, right? Instead of using the Grail for higher pursuits, he used the Grail for lower pursuits, and he ended up with injury on his genitals, and he's caught in this duality. He can't sit and he can't stand, and there was thought to be this relationship between the king and the land, where if the land was sick, then or if the king was sick, then so was the land, and the land had become a wasteland, and there was this sick king. They call him the Fisher King, and that's important because that relates to the age of Pisces, this Fisher King. And immediately when Persifal sees the Fisher King and he sees what he's going through, he wants to go help him, and then he thinks, oh, I don't, years have gone by and he's become a knight. They don't call him the fool anymore, and he's become a respected knight, and he thinks to himself, well, gosh, I really want to go to the king's aid, but I can't because there are certain rules, and the rules say don't speak to someone of a higher authority unless they speak to you first. And so he doesn't want to be viewed as the fool, right? So he doesn't say anything, and that night they put Persifal, they put him to bed, and he wakes up the next morning and he's alone in the woods. The Grail Castle's gone, the king's gone, all of it, the Mount Salvation, all of it's gone, and he's just alone in the woods. And he says, geez, what happened? I was right there. And he kind of has a low moment, and he said, well, I agreed to this Grail Quest, so I'm going to keep on the Grail Quest. And years and years go by, and he's just having a tough time. His armor's falling apart, and he's starting to lose faith, right? And he comes across this hermit, and the hermit's name is Trevisrent. And Trevisrent says, come into my little abode here. I'll make you some dinner. It's cold and wet outside. You get in out of the cold for the night. And so Persifal goes to have dinner with the hermit Trevisrent, and Trevisrent says, he tells him that he's on the Grail Quest, and Trevisrent says, okay, well, I made you some dinner. Let's sit down and pray before dinner. And Persifal says, I'm not going to pray. And Trevisrent says, well, what do you mean you're not going to pray? You're on the Grail Quest. And Persifal said, I've done everything. I've done exactly as I was supposed to do, and this Grail Quest is so elusive. He's having this low point, and he says, I'm not going to pray. And Trevisrent says, fine, well, I'm going to tell you right now, if you can't pray, you're not going to be able to find the Holy Grail. And Persifal says, I don't care. And so he doesn't pray, and he eats his food, and the next day he tells Trevisrent, I'll be on my way, and he gets on his horse, and he decides he's just gonna let his horse decide where to go. He's just gonna let what will happen, right? And he lets go of the reins of the horse, and immediately the horse takes him to the Grail Castle. And he gets to the Grail Castle, and he sees the Fisher King, and at this point he doesn't care about the rules of knighthood anymore. He runs up to the king, and he says, what ails thee? How can I help you? And it was this act of love, this act of compassion, that caused the Holy Grail to appear. And the Holy Grail appears, and Persifal is able to heal the Fisher King with the Holy Grail, and the Grail King says thank you, and he appoints Persifal as the new Grail King, and says, I'll be on my way, and he dies. And there's a Grail Maiden that brings in the Grail, and Persifal is allowed to drink from the Grail, and when Persifal drinks from the Grail, he experiences a gnosis, right? And that's the story of Persifal. So, and that comes from the book by Wolfram von Eschenbach. It's called Persifal, however you like to say it. So from the foreword of that book, he says, Persifal is a retelling and ending by one genius, Wolfram von Eschenbach, of the unfinished romance of another, the Persifal of Chrétien de Troyes, a poem otherwise known from its prologue, the story of the Grail. Chrétien's poem is the earliest extant narrative of the Grail, though he tells us that his patron Philip, Count of Flanders, had lent him its book, presumably in one or another respect a source, but a work absolutely of unknown content. Wolfram, whose great stature as a poet is known independently from his earlier love poetry and his later epic Wilhelm and the Elegiac Tituro, rose magnificently to the challenge by retelling and completing Chrétien's mystery story, achieving it in a very different and indeed imitatable style. If glimpsing the title Persifal, the reader picks up this book in hopes of finding the story of the Grail, he will not find it. He will find instead the story of a Grail, together with everything else he is entitled to expect of a story told by one of the world's greatest narrative poets and humorists. There never was a story of the Grail, and never could be. On the other hand, there were stories of as many different Grails as there were writers or syndicates exploiting the potent name. How open a question the physical nature of the Grail still was in circa 1200 when Wolfram embarked on his Persifal is shown by the fact that his Grail, he calls it Grail, was a stone, and that although it had the loftiest spiritual connections, it also had some very earthly aspects. And that's from the Penguin classic Wolfram von Eschenbach, Persifal. So when we start making some of these different connections with the tarot, when we talk about the Hermit Trevisrent, when we talk about the Hermit card, the word Trevisrent means 3 times great, and so what this is a reference to Hermes Trismegistus from alchemical literature, from Hermetic philosophy. Hermes Trismegistus is represented by the Hermit card in the tarot and is represented by this character Trevisrent in the story of Persifal. This book is called The Grail Quest, Search for Transcendence by Earl de Motte. In chapter 6 he says, The Grail and Alchemy. Alchemy, as popularly understood, was intent on chemical transmutation of metals into finer stuff, the purest metal being gold. To some within the alchemical movement, however, the interest in the search for gold by chemical processes was possibly a subterfuge which concealed the work of the transcendental alchemists. The latter was concerned with spiritual change within themselves and humanity in general, and may be described as an early form of practical psychology and mystical philosophy. It was a worldview and a form of action aimed at changing human nature, or transforming or transmuting it, without recourse to guidance from any religious doctrine or church mediation. Others see this phase of alchemy as an attempt to apply in matter those principles that worked to effect spiritual change in humanity. In other words, it was not a pretext for something else, but an attempt to apply the Hermetic law of correspondences, as above, so below. And again, we get into this Hermetic philosophy, this Hermes Trismegistus, and his philosophy is of as above, so below, as within, so without. And this philosophy is very present in Wolfram von Eschenbach's book Persifal. And this would have been completely hereditary at the time. And he was able to disguise a lot of this Gnostic philosophy in this book Persifal. Another book here is called Grail Alchemy, Initiation into the Celtic Mystery Tradition by Mara Freeman. This talks about the inner meaning of the Grail Quest. From the esoteric viewpoint, Chrétien's story takes Persifal through the classic stages of the incarnated soul. Like the hero of many fairy tale, he is the youngest son, completely innocent of worldly ways. His ridiculous dress, along with rash and impulsive actions, cast him in the traditional role of the fool, setting out on life's adventures for the first time. In archetypal terms, he is the young masculine, separating from the overly protective old feminine, in this case his mother, who has kept him buried in the wild forest, the antithesis of the masculine world of the court. Grail scholar Glenys Gutnick points to parallels between the story of the Grail's hero's origin and the legend of the Welsh Saint Madrone, another widowed mother who had to flee from her enemies with her youngest son. Just like Persifal's mother, Saint Madrone dies with her last son, chooses to leave her to become a knight. Madrone is a thinly disguised version of Madrone, the Welsh mother goddess who was originally called Matrona, or in her triple ascent, the Matrones, in the Roman Celtic era. Her death is symbolic of the passing away of the old matriarchal era at the coming of the new warrior-based society of the Celts. Another clue to Percival's symbolic identity is the fact that he is a son of the widow, a term applied to initiates in Freemasonry. This term derives from the religion of early Egypt, where the original widow was Isis, the mother of Horus, whose husband Osiris was killed by an enemy. The same destiny belongs to earlier goddesses of the Near East, such as Inanna and Ishtar, who were also separated from their consorts. Rudolf Steiner had an interesting theory about this expression, believing the mother refers to the soul, the one who conceives, while father refers to spirit, the force that fructifies the soul with divine influence. According to Steiner, since the fall in Atlantean times, the father principle has withdrawn, widowing the soul. Humanity is thrown back onto itself. We must find the light of truth within our own soul in order to find divine guidance. Percival is one of the many such heroes of the soul's initiation into higher consciousness. Too immature to have learned self-direction, Percival gets into trouble by following the rules of his elders, who are the representatives of conventional society. Slavishly and without understanding, Percival first forces his attentions on an unknown woman and later fails to respond appropriately to the events at the Grail Castle. Yet his later quest for the feminine is prefigured early in the story, for he is the only person willing to be Guinevere's champion when she is rudely assaulted by the Red Knight. In this episode, Guinevere is clearly shown in her role as a goddess of sovereignty with her cup of wine. The seizing and spilling of her cup is tantamount to the gravest insult imaginable. Yet only the young and uncouth visitor to Arthur's court is brave enough to avenge her honor. By defeating the boorish Red Knight, Percival has overcome his id, or instinctual self, and is now ready to be instructed into the ways of the world. First, through the manly arts of knighthood, which include how to conduct himself in society, and second, in the arts of romantic and sexual love. Under Blancheflore's influence, his heart begins to open, and he feels the first stirrings of remorse for leaving his mother in such a thoughtless fashion. It is significant that he's looking for his mother when he is led, seemingly by chance, to the Grail Castle. Percival's quest symbolizes the search of the collective Western psyche for the lost feminine, once despised and now deeply desired. At the Grail Castle, the young knight attains a vision of the Grail, but he is not yet mature enough to fully comprehend it. For the next step in the initiatory process is to go beyond the personality, to die to the egoic self in order to attain a greater spiritual prize, the Grail. This requires coming to terms with one's personal shadow and facing the limitations of the ego, an experience often undergone in midlife and termed the dark night of the soul. So that's from Grail Alchemy by Mara Freeman. And we talk about the different archetypes in the tarot, and in the beginning of the story, Percival's known as the Fool, and I showed you the Fool's card. And so the story of the tarot is that the Fool goes on a quest, and he encounters all these different archetypal characters in the 22 trumps of the tarot, or the remaining 21 trumps of the tarot. And this is called The Fool's Pilgrimage, Kabbalistic Meditations on the Tarot by Stephen A. Holler. In Chapter 7, it's called The Fool's Pilgrimage. The human being is a fool. Shakespeare was right when he said, "What fools we mortals be." The first card of the Greater Arcana, the Fool, pictures man as a carefree youth, striding gaily forth in such a position that his next step may send him over the edge of the cliff. As noted in connection with the 11th path, we are this fool ourselves, divine and immortal souls, ready to transcend into manifest existence. It is also we ourselves, having descended from Kether to Malkuth, now ascending from earth to the heavens. Of all the arcana, the Fool manifests the greatest freedom. Although technically attributed to the 11th path, He is in very truth on all paths and in all the Sephiroth at the same time, since he is the very life, the nourishing essence or sap of the tree. It is this very freedom that makes him a fool. It is a sad fact of life that men are more afraid of freedom than anything else, even more than slavery or death. Being restricted by rules, taboos, and regulations provides the personality, which lacks ego strength, with a feeling of security, without which it would perish like a clam without its shell or a crab without its armor. But the first time must come when the psalmist wrote, "Fear shall be in the way." That is, when we must grow strong, deriving our fortitude from the inward resources of our soul, rather from the puny constructions of mortal minds and human society. The time must come when we shall be willing to bear the burden of freedom and relinquish the crutches and burdensome armors of tradition, society, church, nation, culture, and family, or any other substitute for the one and only source of strength, wisdom, and goodness, the union of our individual soul with the divine ground within which it is rooted. Within the individual personality, the higher self, or mystic fool, forever pokes fun at the worldly goals and methods of the lower ego and prods it to turn from the ways of the blind fool to those of the wise fool. Similarly, mystics and Gnostics have always been the true salt of the earth, the leaven of every inner society within which they resided. Where there is no vision, the people perish. A nation or society without individuals who can make contact with the divine world is doomed to failure and downfall. And that's from The Fool's Pilgrimage by Stephen Holler. And so it's not just the tarot trumps that correspond to this story, but also, of course, the cups, the different the Knight of Cups, for instance. So in this book, Studies on the Mystical Tarot by Yolanda M. Robinson, she talks about the Knight of Cups, and she says, versions of the Grail legend are present in Waite's minor arcana, and this is the knight who is more in love with romance than with adventure. Does he represent Lancelot or Percival? In the earlier versions of the Grail myth, Percival brings to the queen and kingdom the fertility lacking in the barren fisher king. Is that what this cup intimates? The knight and his horse connect us to key 13, death, assigned to the Hebrew letter nun or fish, and to the fixed water sign Scorpio, another symbol of fertility. The resemblance between this card and 13 could be interpreted as the symbolic death and alchemy of the king and the birth of a new king. In addition, the knight's gray horse is gray, which signals union of opposites and serves as symbol of spiritual growth and maturity. So there are also connections in the small cards too, and especially like in the Ace of Cups. This is from the Builders of the Aditum deck, but often you'll see this Grail with the W, maybe for wisdom, and you have this dove coming down and these lotus flowers, and you'll see on the cover of this book, the Grail Quest, you'll see exactly that same thing, that same motif with these flowers and this water, and you have this Grail here. There's a 9-pointed star on this one, an Enneatic star, whereas this one has like a W, but still the concepts here are the same with these doves and these Templar crosses in the corner, and this dove and this Templar cross here coming down on this Ace of Cups. So that would be another connection in the tarot. This book is called The Tarot: History, Mystery, and Lore by Cynthia Giles, and in here she talks about the different connections between the tarot and the Holy Grail. The connection of the tarot and the Grail material has suggested some interesting ideas, such as tarot scholar George Wald's explanation of the mysterious Tower card, which was originally called the House of God. The card portrays one of the most striking incidents in legends surrounding King Arthur and his Knights of the Holy Grail. A dolorous stroke struck in the Grail Castle, the House of God, by one of Arthur's knights, the luckless Sir Balin. According to Sir Thomas Mallory's account, in the incident when Sir Balin smote King Palem with the Grail spear, which he had discovered in the castle tower, Therewith the castle roof and walls broke and fell to the earth. The wound received by King Pelham would not heal, and he became the Fisher King, whose illness and impotence brought disaster to his people and turned his realm into the wasteland. The Emperor and the Hanged Man have been associated with the Fisher King before and after his wound. So if you could think about that wounded Fisher King, the Emperor and the Hanged Man have been associated with the Fisher King before and after his wound. So there's some other important connections between the tarot and the Holy Grail. Although the Arthurian cycle of legends concerned Britain, Wall points out, it was read by Italians and French as well, and indeed was known throughout Europe as a subject of art. There seems good reason to see some influence of the Grail legends at work in the tarot, and nothing contradicts the idea. The influence may go back even further, to connections with Celtic treasures, as Weston proposed, and to other pagan motifs as well. So that's from the history of the tarot. This is a fascinating book called The Tarot Trumps and the Holy Grail, Great Secrets of the Middle Ages by Margaret Starbird. I'll read from the back of the book. This book reveals the strong link between the trump cards of the tarot and the medieval heresy of the Holy Grail. The adherents of the Grail heresy believed Jesus was married, that his wife and child found political refuge in Gaul, and that his bloodline, the Sang Grail of the royal house of David, survived in Europe. The enigmatic tarot trumps provided a visual catechism for these other Christians whose faith was brutally suppressed by the Roman Catholic Inquisition. The symbols of the tarot whisper the great secrets of the alternative Christian church of the Middle Ages, the Church of Love. Margaret Starbird's broader thesis is the return of the lost feminine, Mary Magdalene, the bride and beloved of Jesus, so long denied to the Christian tradition. Starbird is the author of 2 previous books about the lost bride, The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail, and The Goddess in the Gospels, Reclaiming the Sacred Feminine. Starbird holds a master's degree from the University of Maryland and studied at the Christian L.V.X. University in Kiel, Germany, and the Vanderbilt Divinity School. So this is the Tarot Trumps and the Holy Grail, and there's a lot of great connections in here that she makes. A monk in the 15th century warned of the danger inherent in the images of the tarot trumps, describing them as rungs on a ladder that leads straight to the depths of hell. Beyond the condemnation of gaming in general, the cards were understood to be heretical and therefore dangerous. But interpreters of the cards cannot explain why that impassioned view was so widespread. What great secret was coded in the images on the cards that could be powerful enough to split the rock of the Roman Catholic establishment? I believe that close scrutiny of the individual cards and their relationship to the heresy of the Grail holds the key to the correct interpretation. And she goes on here to talk about the Fool, the archetype of the Fool. The Fool is a simpleton as an archetype. He is on a journey to learn the truth and must ask questions along the way. Other early tarot packs present the Fool as an iterant beggar, his faithful dog at his heels, since the dog in medieval art is often a symbol for its English anagram. It represents the presence of God in iconography. The wise fool is ubiquitous in fairy tale, often rewarded for an altruistic good or daring deed he performs, a gratuitous act of kindness. So that act of kindness when he goes to the Grail King and asks, how can I help you? Or the daring deed when he takes on the Red Knight who's offended Guinevere. We are fools for Christ is the slogan of the Albigensian preachers of the gospel who traveled in pairs, working in the fields side by side with the peasants of Provence, showing their bread and propagating the word of God. We hunger and thirst, we are naked and buffeted, and we have no fixed abode. We are reviled and we bless, are persecuted and we bear with it. These fools for Christ were the pure ones, or Cathari, or the Cathars, the initiate preachers of the Cathar heresy, so ruthlessly suppressed by the Inquisition and mercenary armies of the Pope and King during the bitter years of the brutal Albigensian Crusade from 1209 to 1250. And that's the Tarot Trumps and the Holy Grail. You could also get into the magical interpretation of Persifal and the Star Goddess, and this is written by Frater Akkad. I won't go too far into that, but I think there's some great information in there. There's really good magical interpretation of that story. And in this book, Rosicrucian History and Mysteries, there's a brief mention about spiritual knighthood. We find traces of such a spiritual knighthood among the various individuals we have discussed. Around the time of Joachim of Fior, undertook the foundation of the monastic order in the spirit of primitive Christianity, Wolfram von Eschenbach developed in Germany the idea of a knighthood common to Christianity and Islam. His Parsifal, which Richard Wagner made into Parsifal, is derived from an Arab text that Quixote de Provence had obtained in Toledo. This version of the Grail legend is of Iranian origin. It is amazing to realize that the Grail in Parsifal is a precious stone upon which the dove of the Holy Spirit descended. One tradition states that the stone is an emerald from which the chalice of the Grail was cut. So in one of the stories there was a fight in heaven between the different angels, and Lucifer was in this fight, and he had this big emerald in his crown, and one of the angels knocked this emerald out of his crown, and a couple of neutral angels brought this emerald to earth to hide it, and that's part of the legend of the Holy Grail, that the being a stone, being that philosopher's stone. So here again in the Grail Quest, Search for Transcendence, he talks about exploring the nature of alchemy as it manifested in the 15th and 17th centuries. One cannot help but recognize the affinity between the objective of this art science and the transformative values of the Grail Quest. The Alchemists Workshop was the place where things were to happen, just as the forest and otherworld were the field of experience for the Grail Knight. Both alchemy and Grail mythology had their metaphors for the total psyche, its dynamic and its direction for optimum psychic health. The vessels that symbolized the Grail, as they appeared in different accounts of the romances and in the Alchemist's Workshop, were associated with the initiatory process. Platter, cup, or chalice, casket, or stone were analogous to the crucible, flask, or alembic. The content in either case was a transforming substance or substances to which added the fire of experience and the stone of wisdom, the necessary parts of the initiate's consciousness-raising program. MacLean notes that each form of the Grail Knight's quest could be seen to play a significant role in the elevation of humanity. The platter provided spiritual nourishment. The chalice offered redemption or grace, and the stone brought about enlightenment. These alchemical processes taking place in the vessels were tinged with Grail esotericism. Cathedrals communicate the secret tradition. The overlap of Grail symbolism and alchemy, together with the elements of astrology, the Kabbalah, and ancient mythology, found a comfortable mix with the Orthodox Christianity in the famous Gothic cathedrals of Notre Dame. Their sculptured art, architecture, and stained glass windows have left a lasting record of medieval people's attempt to unify their total experience. On the Grail theme, we may draw attention to the relevant images in Chartres Cathedral. The statue of Melchizedek, placed among numerous statues in the portholes, shows him bearing the Christian Grail cup with the hermetic stone of Wolfram placed in it. Both Grail symbols were combined and linked with the theme of the priest-king, a ruler whose spiritual and temporal dominions are one. A window shows the joust in heaven between a Christian and a Saracen knight, meant to represent Percival and Firefizz, his half-Saracen stepbrother. The lance of one is fractured in the middle, and the other is held straight on impact, so that between the two knights a triangle is formed, reminding one of the law symbolized by the geometrical figure. The skirmish seems to be taking place in some space between earth and sky. In the story, the two brothers, recognizing each other, embrace each other. The whole symbol shows the reconciliation of contradictions at a higher spiritual level. There is also a porthole of initiation, a statue of the Ark of the Covenant, some would say another form of the Grail, brought by an ox cart from Jerusalem to Chartres. Such specific reference to the Grail myth form part of a variable museum of alchemical message in this and other Notre Dame cathedrals. There are theories about the cathedrals as being themselves alchemical experiments, and Fulcanelli, in his book The Mystery of the Cathedrals, explains all the different explains Notre Dame and the different cathedrals as giant alchemical experiments where the person, as they go in to the cathedral, are themselves part of this alchemical experiment. The Grail as the Philosopher's Stone. When we consider Wolfram's poem Persifal, where the Grail is described as a stone, we have no doubt he was talking about the Philosopher's Stone. This, together with other references to the stone being an emerald, the chivalric virtues shown by Firefizz, the character of Trevisrent, his insistence on the Grail story being of Oriental provenance, contained in a document found in Toledo, among other allusions, point to Wolfram being a hermetic master within the stream of Rosicrucian thought. It was no coincidence that the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, and a collection of documents described as the Corpus Hermeticum, had reached Europe from Arabic sources during the period of the Crusades. It is therefore hypothesized that the true version of the story being of Islamic Judaic origin and transmitted by the mysterious Kiot de Provence, who was not to be taken literally, but as Wolfram's imaginative reconstruction of Hermetic truths. And there are some that would say that this Kiot de Provence is Giot de Provence, who is a Knights Templar. The Philosopher's Stone of Alchemy was the prima materia of creation, possessing superhuman or divine powers. It had the connotation of being precious or priceless because it was hard to find. The story that the Grail stone first appeared on the crown or forehead of Lucifer linked the Grail with similar jewels in Eastern mysticism, like the Emerald Eye of Horus, the Shawarma of the Iranians, and the Padma Mani of the Buddhists. These jewels were usually located at the mystical center, often the forehead of the god, suggesting strongly the significance of this as a physical object standing in for inner spiritual insight of the third eye. Identified mystically as the pineal gland, it is regarded as the bridge between the physical and material planes. This is the stone that facilitates mystical consciousness. In this stone, the spark of divinity could dispel the darkness of error and ignorance in mankind, for mankind as a microcosm or the reflection of God carries within itself the divine spark imprisoned in matter or its material body. Once its powers were understood and applied properly, the pineal gland would take mankind beyond the normally perceived limits of everyday reality. Mankind in general has lost the power to use his third eye, which makes the retrieval of the power, if sought after, much more difficult. Alchemically, this is the stone of wisdom, of the light of understanding. It opens the doors of perception. As such, the quest for the stone of wisdom should be seen as another quest for the Grail. It transforms people and confers unusual power. The Grail poets initiated and revealed by using the literary medium. The alchemists and the Rosicrucians used three other techniques: allegory of metals and their transmutation, the pictorial representation of the events happening in the Alchemists' Workshop, and finally, in written narrative, the replacement of the nightly quest by the mystic's quest. And here he talks about Trevisrent and the connection with Hermes Trismegistus. It is to be noted that Trevisrent is Wolfram's construct of the thrice great Hermes. Tre, three, Zent is equivalent to scientia, knowledge, science, three aspects of knowledge. The path winds its way to the top, the path to the Grail, the journey to the alchemical wedding. On this path, the initiate or the Grail Knight encounters various animals and significant events. They represent symbols of the trials and temptations experienced by the quester and the change processes occurring in his character. Then he talks about the connections between the Grail story and the story of Persifal and the journey of Christian Rosenkreutz from the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. Finally, we find alchemy reverting to the literary medium of the Grail romances. Two instances are worth recording. The first is the Roman de la Rose, written by Loris and de Meung of the 14th century. This work can be interpreted, says Sergei Hutin, as an exaltation of the mystical great work and the discovery of the philosopher's stone, by means of which the human soul attains after many ordeals the perfect serenity of initiation. The rose symbolizes divine grace and the stone. In the second instance, the knightly quest is replaced by an alchemical drama in prose, the main character being the alchemist himself. The work, entitled The Alchemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, opens with Christian in his study or laboratory in a hut on a lonely hillside. It is a wild, stormy night, and he senses that he is in the presence of some great danger. He is suddenly visited by a huge angel who manifests in an orb of blinding light. He is dumbfounded and fearful. This is his Grail quest, and he reacts as the Knights of the Round Table did on the first visit of the Grail in their myths. Then comes the act of love or grace, for in that moment the illumination he is given an invitation to attend the royal wedding, and the angel disappears. From that moment, having passed his test as a result of diligent study and the practice of true alchemy, humbled by his experience and spurred on by hope, he commences his bewildering journey to the nuptials, or the final enlightenment, in which he is the unconscious participant. This allegorical journey, then, is the Rosicrucian and alchemical equivalent of the Grail Knight on the Grail Quest. It is full of symbolic meaning and rich imagery, and a masterful presentation of the initiatic tradition. That's from the Grail Quest, Search for Transcendence by Earl de Moe. So that's the story of Persifal, and there's also a lot of really interesting connections with the Knights Templar. The book Persifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach was first published, and the company that first published it will also, at the very same time, within maybe a year or two, they published a book called the Zohar, which is very important in Kabbalistic tradition. The Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar are considered the two most important books in Kabbalistic philosophy, and for this book publisher to print Persifal and to print the Zohar at the very same time is very telling. And there's connections to Knights Templar, there's connections to other Gnostic groups. There's also some references to the Chiamante Stone and Nicholas Roerich, who is very instrumental in the setting up of the United States, with Francis Bacon, who'd received a lot of his knowledge from John Dee. So again, it's this Rosicrucian Gnostic lineage. These stories come down, and there's a lot of connections. I can't make all of the connections, but these are some of the connections, and that might inspire you to look into other connections, and I'm hoping it inspires you to read the book of Persifal, if nothing else, because I think that would be a good book for anyone to read. Also, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, I think would be a great book for anybody to read. So, a wise friend told me that a good presentation gives the listener something to take home with them, and everybody's different. So what we take with us is different. We're not all going to take away the same thing from this story of Persifal. But what you can learn from the story of Persifal and the Holy Grail and its connections to the Tarot are this concept of archetypes, and you can also learn about the concept of duality. And so these are lenses through which you can view your life, right? And so if you start to view life through this lens of duality, then you can see this, that where you want to be is taking this middle way. The Gnostics tend to take this middle way, and also there's when Persifal goes to the Grail King and says, "What ails thee? How can I help you?" What he's showing is compassion, and he's let his compassion for the Grail King who's suffering, he's let that overcome his pride. He's let that overcome his fear of being called a fool. He didn't like to be called a fool, but he didn't care if he was called a fool because he wanted to show compassion to the Fisher King because he was suffering. And so these are some of the different lessons that we can learn from the Persifal story. And again, what everybody takes away from the video and from the story will be different, but the concept of archetypes, where you might be playing the role of the fool and your friend may be playing the role of the hermit, and that you can oftentimes switch these roles depending on different relationships with different people, and maybe 10 years might go by and you guys might flip these roles where they're playing the role of the fool and you're playing the role, a different archetypal role. And so what the tarot does is teach you about these different archetypes, about these different archetypal energies and different archetypal personalities. And that's also, these concepts are also to be found in the story of Persifal. So these are lenses through which we can view the world. And I think any lens by which you can view the world is giving you something that you can take with you from this story. Also, sometimes we have to unlearn things. It took Persifal a few years of being out there alone and in the woods for him to unlearn all this knightly ways, so that when he did see the Fisher King, he could go to him with compassion. And also it talks about just going with your gut instincts, and Persifal's gut instinct originally, the first time that he saw the Grail King at the castle, originally he wanted to go up to the Grail King and ask him, what's wrong? How can I help you? But he couldn't because that was not within the rules, not within the rules of knighthood. And eventually he had to unlearn these rules of knighthood, and he had to let his compassion overcome his sense of pride, so that he didn't care if he was called a fool. He wanted to go see what he could do to help the Fisher King. And it was this compassion and this love that caused the Grail to appear. And so we talk about our lives in spiritual alchemy. These are the lessons that we can learn, that we can view the world through this lens of archetypes. We can view the world through this lens of dichotomy. Sometimes we need to unlearn what we have learned, and sometimes we just need to go with our gut instincts and be compassionate and show the compassionate. If something within you moves you to show compassion to somebody else, then that's what you should do, regardless of how you might look doing it. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you want to like, share, and subscribe, that'd be great. Peace profound, and L.V.X.